Hey, and how you doing, folks? Yours truly, Randee here, and welcome to another edition of today's talk. Today we talk to Richard Rothstein, and he's the research associate of the Economic Policy Institute. He's also a senior fellow of the Chief Justice Earl Warren Institute on Law and Social Policy at the University of California, Berkeley School of Law. He's also a contributing editor of the American Prospect and an occasional contributor. We spoke today about his two articles that were talking about what can schools do to address poverty, and that's the title of one of his articles, What Can Schools Do to Address Poverty, and the other article is Whose Problem is Poverty? It was a great interview. He's a very well educated man and can certainly speak up and down about poverty and how it affects children and so forth and so on. He's also the author of a book that just came out called The Color of Law. And I'm certainly looking forward to buying that book and reading it and having him come back to the show. Certainly you want to pick that up and read it. We also talked about segregation and the role that segregation plays in the housing of poor children, financially disadvantaged children, as well as the role that segregation plays in housing. And he made the correlation of how, children that live in segregated neighborhoods who are financially challenged or poor, to be quite frank, how they, attend subpar schools and have subpar surroundings, and these subpar surroundings contribute mightily, even to the health of these children, as he makes the argument that, rodents and other kind of pestilence lead to detrimental health effects on these children. And he's a walking encyclopedia, and you certainly want to check out this interview. The man has a lot to say, and I certainly would strongly recommend that you check this interview out. Thank you for the time, and this is Randee Rand for today's talk. And we're back. Yours truly, Randee Rand here for another version of today's talk. Welcome, as we are speaking to Mr. Richard Rothstein, and he is from the Economic Policy Institute. He's a research associate there, as he is also a senior fellow of the Chief Justice Earl Warren Institute on Law and Social Policy at the University of California, Berkeley School of Law. He's also a contributing editor of the American Prospect and an occasional contributor, and he's the author of the book The Color of Law, which is available on Amazon, which is coming out in early 2017. Welcome to the show, Richard, and how are you?
Thank you very much.
We're going to be discussing two articles that you've written or either contributed to. Those articles are entitled What can schools do to address poverty, and whose problem is poverty? The first question is, in your article, you suggested that schools have only a limited influence on closing the achievement gap between students who live in poverty and their more affluent peers unless school improvement is combined with broader and social and economic reforms. What type of other social and economic reforms were you talking about?
Well, the major causes of low achievement of disadvantaged children are the economic and social conditions with which they come to school. And these economic and social disadvantages are numerous. I can give you a few examples. One, for example, to take a simple one, is that children living in low-income urban neighborhoods have a much higher rate than children who live in middle-class neighborhoods, simply because the pollution is greater in urban neighborhoods, and the environmental conditions generally, the vermin, the lack of cleanup in the neighborhood, induces much more asthma than living in a more healthy environment. Well, children who have asthma are awake at night. If they come to school, they're more drowsy, they're absent more often. If you take two groups of children who are equal in every respect, except that one group of children is absent more often because of asthma or is drowsy in school, the group of children with asthma is going to achieve at lower levels on average than the children who don't have that level of asthma. And we know that African American children in urban neighborhoods have asthma at about 4 times the rate of middle-class white children.
Wow.
So what I was saying was that there are many, many conditions like this that affect children living in low-income urban neighborhoods. And when you add them up all together, they explain a good part of the achievement gap. And there's nothing that schools can do to eliminate these causes. A good teacher can spend more time giving special attention to a child who's drowsy than a child who's not. But a good teacher can't completely overcome this disadvantage or any of the many other disadvantages with which children come to school.
Now, in your article, you stated, and I quote, educators have a special and unique insight into the damage that deprivation does to children's learning potential. End quote. Could you please explain what you meant by this statement?
Well, building on what I said a minute ago, most people who are not in schools, and most middle-class people, don't have day-to-day contact with disadvantaged children, and so they don't appreciate these problems. But a teacher in an urban school, particularly in a minority school in a segregated neighborhood, sees children every day who come to school drowsy because of asthma. They see children every day who can't pay attention because they are hungry. They see children every day who are traumatized because of violence in the neighborhood. All of these things contribute to their low achievement, and teachers are very much aware of this. So they have no trouble understanding that they're being asked to overcome conditions which have no causes in the school itself and which can't be overcome by schools themselves.
If you could speak about the detrimental effects that poverty has on children that can't afford present day technology that they need in order to be successfully academically.
Well, I don't think technology is the solution to any of this. Technology is an add-on to literacy, to numeracy. It's not a substitute for it.
Mm-hmm.
And technology cannot overcome the social and economic disadvantages that I've been discussing. A child, for example, who is stressed because his or her parent has just experienced unemployment, is going to come to school under stress. And technology is not going to overcome that stress. That child is going to do more poorly because of that stress than a child who comes from a secure home where daily income is not a problem. Technology is certainly an addition to school curriculum, but it has no relevance to the kinds of social and economic problems that we're discussing. It can't overcome them.
Now, many condemn teachers and accuse them of failure when it comes to educating children efficiently. As per your assertion, this can be a foolish endeavor, especially when you consider the other contributing factors to students' inability to focus and learn successfully. What is the downside of people jumping to unfairly criticizing and blaming teachers?
Well, we've had some failed education reforms for the
Mm-hmm.
last 20 or 30 years because of this inability of our public policymakers to understand the causes of low achievement. And so we enacted a No Child Left Behind law, for example, in 2001, and have slightly modified it recently with a law called the um, ESSA,
Mm-hmm.
modification of the No Child Left Behind law, based on the fact that the reason that children's achievement is low is because teachers have low expectations of them, and if only we hold teachers accountable for student performance, they will do well. The law has been a complete failure. We have not eliminated the achievement gap, even substantially narrowed it by holding teachers accountable. What we have done is narrowed the curriculum to place excessive emphasis on testing as a way of measuring teacher performance, as though somehow if we tested children more, teachers would be afraid not to teach well and could overcome the kinds of problems that I've been describing. But testing is not going to make, more testing is not going to make children come to school better able to learn if they come from environments which have social and economic conditions that prevent them from learning.
We are speaking with Richard Rothstein. He's a research associate of the Economic Policy Institute. He's a senior fellow of the Chief Justice Earl Warren Institute on Law and Social Policy at the University of California, Berkeley School of Law. He's also a contributing editor of the American Prospect and an occasional contributor. He's also the author of the new book that's come out, The Color of Law, which is available on Amazon, and it's coming out in early 2017. And we're so grateful that he's given us some of his very valuable time today. Richard, what else has your years of experience told you about children that are striving to do well academically, but first have to come to grips with poverty?
Well, I think the main lesson that I've learned is that despite everything I've said about the disadvantages that children, low-income children, and particularly African-American children in low-income neighborhoods come to school with. If a child comes to school stressed because of violence in the neighborhood, because of a parental unemployment shock, a teacher in an integrated school can give that child special attention and try to overcome the stress that the child is coming to school with. But if you take children like that and concentrate them in schools where every child has one or another or many of these kinds of disadvantages, it's impossible to give special attention to every child.
Sure.
So all the problems that I've been describing are exacerbated by segregation. When you concentrate children in schools with disadvantages, the impediments to high achievement are increased. So the first step we need to take in order to address these kinds of problems is to do a more aggressive job in integrating schools. And unfortunately, we can't integrate schools unless we integrate neighborhoods, because most children who go to segregated schools go to those schools because they're living in segregated neighborhoods. So segregation is a central part of this problem that's separate from the individual social and economic disadvantages with which children come to school.
Now, excuse me, you mentioned, these African American children, minorities, living in segregated neighborhoods, and they're subpar and they're going to subpar schools because of one reason or the other. Of course, one of the reasons being that their parents are unemployed or underemployed. I want to know, does job spatial mismatch play a role in families' abilities to stay in or out of poverty? Please explain.
Well, one of the reasons that the conditions of some low-income minority neighborhoods have deteriorated over the last few generations and have concentrated children with disadvantages so heavily in those neighborhoods is because jobs that used to exist in those neighborhoods have disappeared. Mm-hmm. First, they fled to the suburbs. Many of them have fled overseas. And whereas you used to have segregated neighborhoods which were had a full class structure. You had middle class African Americans, lower class African Americans, people with good jobs, people with bad jobs, all living in the same neighborhood. Now we have a situation where inner city or urban neighborhoods are concentrated poverty. Middle class African Americans have been able to leave, frequently to segregated middle class African American neighborhoods, but they've been able to leave, leaving the conditions in those neighborhoods much worse than they used to be. And so the disappearance of jobs in those neighborhoods is critical. We do not provide adequate transportation for families in those neighborhoods to get to jobs in the suburbs, and we have not provided ways of desegregating the residences themselves so that families can live in neighborhoods where there are jobs. So you're right, that's a very, very important part of this problem.
In your opinion, is the fix to this problem a matter of the right policy? Please explain.
Well, there are many fixes to this problem, but we have shown very little ability or interest in implementing the fixes. I just mentioned one. We could provide adequate public transportation from urban neighborhoods where minority families are concentrated. We could provide adequate transportation from those neighborhoods to suburban neighborhoods where jobs exist. We don't do it. We could implement policies that would desegregate those neighborhoods. For example, we presently have a program run by the U.S. Department of the Treasury in which tax credits are given to developers to build low and moderate income housing. Those tax credits are used almost exclusively to build housing in already segregated neighborhoods because the land is cheaper, because there's less opposition from middle-class families to having low-income families in their midst. We could very easily prohibit developers from taking those tax credits and using them to construct more housing for low-income families in already low-income neighborhoods and require that they be placed in high-opportunity neighborhoods and middle-class neighborhoods. So there are many policies that we could pursue to address this problem, but we have had little interest in pursuing them.
Now, in your article, you were discussing about factors like uh, epidemic incidence of asthma, as you just mentioned, use of high sulfur heating oil, etc., in urban neighborhoods. You wrote, and I quote, "The fact that such conditions affect blacks more than whites reflects racism in the United States. Calling attention to such conditions is not racist, but ignoring them, insisting that they have no attention to such conditions is not racist. I'm sorry, but ignoring them, insisting that they have no effect if teaching is competent may be," end quote. That's a very profound statement. Do you believe that white Americans believe this is true? And do you believe they may have another name or explanation for this other than racism? Please explain.
Well, in that quote, I was responding to a statement made by one of our most prominent policymakers in education, that it was racist to claim that poor children can't learn as well as middle-class children.
Mm-hmm.
And I was saying that that statement, calling it racist to call attention to these kinds of problems, the social and economic problems that impede children's ability to learn, calling that racist is inappropriate. That was the point I was trying to make. To call someone who calls attention to these problems racist is misguided.
We're speaking with Richard Rothstein. He's the research associate. He's a research associate of the Economic Policy Institute. He's a senior fellow of the Chief Justice Earl Warren Institute on Law and Social Policy at the University of California, Berkeley School of Law. Um, he's a contributing editor of the American Prospect and an occasional contributor, and the author of the new book that's just come out, The Color of Law, which is available on Amazon and is coming out in early 2017. And we're so grateful that he has given us some of his very valuable time today. Richard, in your opinion, what is your opinion, I'm sorry, that about private citizens or communities getting together and developing their own programs that will provide much needed skills these children need in order to be successful academically despite their uh, impoverished condition?
Clearly, we should do everything we can to improve the education of children in disadvantaged neighborhoods. But the most important things we can do to improve their achievement and give them the skills that they need is to improve the economic and social conditions in which they live.
Mm-hmm.
Children taught these skills. Many urban schools, which have low achievement, are better schools than typically middle-class schools which have high achievement, because these urban schools are providing more added value to these children than middle-class schools which take in children who are already high achieving and put them out and then transmit them out with the same high achievement that they came in with. So schools are not the problem. They're not the main problem. Of course, there are some very bad schools in urban neighborhoods. There are some very good ones, and there are some very bad schools in middle-class neighborhoods and some very good ones. The primary reason for the low achievement and disadvantaged children is not because schools are not giving them the skills they need, because they're coming to school with an inability to take advantage of that instruction because of enormous social and economic impediments to their learning. And those are the things that need to be addressed if we're going to raise the achievement of disadvantaged children.
I certainly agree with your position, being that being poverty is the main and major culprit in all of this. Um, as I myself work with children, and they come from less than suitable environments where they're living, and so forth and so on. And I see it every day. You can have the best equipment, you can have the best curriculum in the world, but if that child is not eating, or if the child is listening to his or her mother cry all night long, or parents fight all night long, it's going to affect them, certainly. Um, I couldn't agree with you more. Now, I want to switch gears a little bit, uh, and still talking about your article, um, which is entitled "Whose Problem Is Poverty," where you were talking about responsible reformers, and that they're seeking to help low-income Black parents improve child rearing practices. Uh, and you had said that generally these reformers are Black. If you could please speak about why these Black parents needed to be taught parenting skills in the first place, and if it's made a difference that the reformers were Black as well.
There are some excellent programs that bring support to low-income families that help parents give a better head start to their children. One is called the Nurse Family Partnership, which sends visiting nurses into homes of young mothers, with very young children, and not only provide health care and advice about health care, but also provide guidance to young mothers about how to read to their children, the kinds of questions to ask their children that are more similar to the kinds of questions that middle-class parents typically ask children. So there are programs that support parents who are not well educated and whose own parents weren't well educated, so they've never learned these skills, that support parents who are not well educated in uh, giving their children a head start that's similar to the kind that middle-class children typically get. The Nurse Family Partnership, for example, was promoted by the Obama administration in a very, very token experimental way. It was never enacted as a general program available to all low-income mothers. But these programs do exist. The Nurse Family Partnership is an excellent model, and it has never been expanded on a national basis to be effective.
We have been speaking with Richard Rothstein, who's a research associate of the Economic Policy Institute. He's also a senior fellow of the Chief Justice Earl Warren Institute on Law and Social Policy at the University of California, Berkeley School of Law. And he's a contributing editor of the American Prospect and an occasional contributor. He's also the author of the new book that's just come out, The Color of Law, which is available on Amazon and is coming out in early 2017. And he's been so gracious as to give us some of his very, very time today. Richard, in closing, we thank you for talking with us today. And certainly, if there's your website or any other project that you are involved in, please feel free to plug it.
As you mentioned, my new book, The Color of Law, describes the ways in which neighborhoods were segregated that create many of these problems. You can also find many of my articles that describe these problems in detail on my website, which you can find at the Economic Policy Institute. That's www.epi.org. And I'm one of the experts there at the Institute. And if you go down to my page, you'll find many, many articles that go into detail about these problems.
And if at all possible, we would certainly like it if you came back to the show and discussed your book, The Color of Law. And so we can delve into that, as I'm very interested in reading your book, as I will be out purchasing it. And I really look forward to reading it, because the title itself, The Color of Law, says it all for me, as as I'm pretty sure that it raises some very valuable and viable points that should be made available for public discussion, certainly.
Thanks very much, Randee.
You got it. And that will do it for our interview. Thank you so very much for your time today, Richard.
Thanks a lot.
All right.